Hi, welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Lori Roberts, and today is our last show of the school year. And so we're going to kind of wrap things up. I have my special guest with me today, Lucas Calhoun. Thank you for joining us today. Lucas is actually going to be the host here in just a second. We're going to switch roles and we're going to turn the program over to him because he's the one that's done the most research on the topics he chose. But if you've been following what we've done throughout the year, we started on a timeline before Indiana was even a territory. We started out when we had the Native Americans here and then the French and Indian War, and we took it all the way up to our last show, which was on the Indiana 27th. And Nancy Peabody was here with her great-great-granddaddy's things about the Indiana 27th. So today's timeline is going to take us all the way up to the end of the 19th century. And so our storyline is called Hidden Fun Facts About Indiana. So without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Lori. Thank
coming.
you so much. And it's been a joy. You've done such a great job.
Thank you.
My kids have enjoyed watching it. I know your students have watched many of the episodes too, so it's great that people are getting these different parts about Indiana. So as we move to the 20th century, I wanted to cover the back half of the 19th century, and it all kind of starts with this idea of unique, fun things that happened in Indiana. And the thing that got me started on this idea for this show was actually from when I was in the classroom, and I taught project-based learning, and we were doing this retrospective magazine where each group had a project in a major city, and one of my students had a group of students had a city, Los Angeles, but they had to cover the 1920s, which didn't have a lot of sports teams, and one of the aspects of the project was sports. So one of the students found this team photo of a minor league baseball team, and he said, "Hey, is this good? Is this good enough?" And I said, "It's good, but I think we can do some more." He goes, "Well, what should I do?" And I said, "Well, you see the names. Why don't you pick a name from the roster on the caption and start to research?" The very first person he looks at is a guy named Vic Aldridge.
Vic Aldridge.
So this gentleman right here in the baseball uniform, Vic Aldridge, nicknamed the Hoosier Schoolmaster.
I like him already.
Yeah, I like it too. So he was born in 1893, so it's a little farther ahead in the timeline from some of the things we're going to talk about today, but again, it's the origin of this idea. So this guy served in state legislature, won a World Series in baseball, was in the service, did all of these great things. My students got so excited knowing it was this guy. They ended up making t-shirts with this guy's thing. Over spring break, they went and visited his gravesite in southern Indiana. They made a road trip out of about 13 of them. So that's always stuck with me as a great thing that my students got so excited about a unique fact about Indiana, which kind of led into today. So you guys, it was so, and they still talk about it. I still have the shirt. I've saved it because they had a big thing. And again, what a great nickname, the Hoosier Schoolmaster.
Yeah.
That just sounds neat. So we'll backtrack a little bit to the Civil War. You guys did such a great job on the Indiana 27th. But I just wanted our viewers to know that there's some unique parts about Indiana's participation in the Civil War, because this is definitely not a state that gets the right type of love for the Civil War. Because, I mean, geographically, it was farther away. And, you know, the bloodshed really wasn't here. But some unique things. So, first off, by population, by percentage of population, Indiana the second most volunteers in the war.
Wow.
Which a lot of people wouldn't realize.
You wouldn't think that.
No, because of the timeline and where we were. But within 3 days after shots were fired in Charleston Harbor, Governor Morton, Oliver Morton of Indiana at the time, this gentleman right here, he called for volunteers immediately. Over 200,000 Hoosiers stepped up to fight.
That's amazing.
And volunteer. Yes, they did.
Population-wise, how many people lived in Indiana?
Oh, I should have looked that up. It's such a great question. But it was a tremendous, and in fact, so many people volunteered that they had to turn people away.
Now, I did know that.
At the front end.
Yeah.
But eventually, over 200,000 Hoosiers volunteered, which is, again, we've talked in the show about things that connect all the way up to present day, and Hoosiers are still doing it, still serving and still volunteering with the Indiana National Guard and other units in Indiana. So I really am, just that's a great legacy for our state to have. The interesting other aspect a lot of people don't probably realize is how much that affected the war affected our Indiana's population. So with the Mississippi River having some blockades, as well as the rivers in the southern part of the state, population actually shifted up north towards the Great Lakes and where the railroads were. So that the war, in a roundabout way, redefined some of the population in our state,
Yeah, I never thought
north
about
of
that
Indianapolis.
either, about how the war would have, because it was fought mostly in the South, people, population shift during a time when so many people were
Yeah.
fixated on, their farms, their, having to take over businesses and things that they would want to just pick up and move on top of all that.
Yeah.
So that's
And
interesting.
as a side plug, this is just a great book for viewers out there. It's by an author named Drew Gilpin Faust, and she was, I don't know if she still is, the president of Harvard.
Okay.
And it's called This Republic of Suffering. It talks all about, this is going to be a darker topic, but the work of death in the Civil War, how it changed how, the funeral industry and how, mourning was done, and then how clothing had changed, so you didn't have enough material to make a full mourning outfit, and how that shifted. And because at that point, like 90% of people were born and died at home.
Sure.
And the war completely shifted that.
That's a whole nother topic that, of a show that I've kind of hit around doing, is the mourning and how Victorian time.
Yeah.
But, definitely this threw us into a national mourning period.
Yes.
And changed
Yeah.
everything.
And then changed how you even could process it, because you couldn't
Sure.
do some of the steps that you would do in the past. So,
Yeah.
so that was a big one for the Civil War shaping Indiana. I've been lucky in my years to have been through about 35 states. I don't say that to brag, only as I started counting, and I was kind of intrigued of, and everywhere you go, there's states will highlight things, things that make them unique, or, roadside attractions or whatever. But Indiana has some, and Indiana kind of gets lumped in sometimes to of being a flyover state, where people just go wherever they're going over Indiana.
Right.
But there's some really neat things. So one of the first ones I wanted to talk about is the first peacetime train robbery in the U.S.
Okay.
was in Indiana.
All right.
And it was done in 1866 by the Reno brothers in Jackson County, not
Right.
far from here.
No,
And-
right over the county line.
Exactly. So they planned to rob this train near Seymour, Indiana, and this is Frank Reno. This is the leader of the Klan, and they were going to this hub. And on the evening of October 6th, two Reno brothers, not Frank, but two other ones, and a guy named Frank Sparks, they boarded the Ohio and Mississippi Railway, and they broke into the express car. They took the guard, and they stole and broke open a safe with about $16,000 in it, which again, back then, well, right now that'd be a lot of money, but
Right.
back then that was a whole lot of money. And not content with that really good score, the rest of the gang tried to take another safe, and they couldn't do it, so they pushed it over the side of the train, which, again, this is all while the train is moving, but they were getting chased as this, large posse to try to catch them was coming in.
And that was probably, that was right after the Civil War, and Lincoln had the Pinkerton Agency who had been hired,
Yes.
so the Pinkerton Agency had just started, and so
Yeah.
now their job was to find all these, robbers and whatnot. But when you were talking about the Reno gang, I got tickled. This family, doing some research on them, they were kind of, it was like they had rebelled because they were brought up very religious.
Oh.
One of the things I found out was their family required them to study the Bible for hours. And so with all these children, they had the farm work, and then they also had this stringent religious upbringing that you always had the one black sheep. Well, the black sheep actually was the best out of the whole lot, and his name was Clint, and they called him Honest Clint because he was the best.
And isn't that a character Elvis played in one of his movies? Wasn't he Honest Clint Reno? In one of his early movies? I'm going to have to look that up.
That
I'm
would be a good
intrigued.
trivia question. But they even had a sister, and the sister was even, a rounder. And so, they started off pretty laid back, just kind of cheating at simple
Yeah.
games, and then it kind of built up, So yeah, they were not somebody you'd want your kids hanging around
Yeah.
with, definitely.
And their case, or their robberies and other things, actually led to some pretty widespread federal law, and that is because when they fled after a few robberies, Frank was caught in Canada, and he was extradited back to the U.S., and while he was getting brought back to Indiana to face trial, his train was stopped by a mob, and they lynched the people on the train.
Now,
and
Frank was one of
and
them
Frank
they
was one of
lynched.
them, yes. And in fact, they said, when asked, well, where was this court case? Where was it held? Well, it was tried by Judge Lynch, they said. So he was actually murdered before a trial. So Secretary of State William Seward, who, again, we were talking yesterday, it was interesting. I never thought about him after Lincoln because he was so tied to the
Right.
Lincoln era, but he was still in office, and he was not happy. He wrote some letters of apology and to the state of Indiana saying, we're so sorry, and it led to federal policy on protecting inmates in federal custody.
And that was something else we talked about yesterday, how this all came about from the Lincoln assassination, the
Yes.
starting to the Secret Service, more of that. But also, we talked about the two assassinations, of
Yeah, the
different.
presidential assassinations.
Right, where, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot
Yeah.
before he could, be
They were-
brought to trial.
Where they were held was overwhelmed, and they weren't protected enough, which is still shocking to this
Right,
day. So that was interesting. So we were going to transition now.
Well, let me show where they're
Oh,
buried.
yes,
If
yes,
anybody
yes, this
wants
is a
to
great photo.
see, the Reno gang is buried right in Seymour. There's a little cemetery area set aside in the city cemetery. And if you don't know what you're looking for, there's a plaque or the sign that says, the burial.
Yeah.
And so you could actually go see that. But I have to admit, I lived in Jackson County for about 9 years before we moved back here to Bedford last year, or a year and a half ago. And I had never heard of the Reno gang. That wasn't something we were taught in our Indiana history, unfortunately.
And it's interesting, I love that you showed that photo, because that area and then area where people knew they lived has been really looked at by people in a treasure hunting vibe, because
Yes.
some of the things that they stole were never found. So, it's not uncommon to see people with the metal detectors and trying to
Well-
trying to see if there's randomly
Yeah.
coins from, 140 years ago.
Yeah, because it was 1869
Yeah.
when that started. And we also were talking yesterday about how this was not just news here in
Yeah.
Indiana. They made the national
Exactly.
news.
The New York Times, the paper of record, was covering this,
Yeah.
which is a big deal.
So they were kind of the precursors to, the Outlaws, Butch
Oh,
and
yeah.
Sundance, and some of those,
Yeah.
the other notorious bank
Yeah.
robbers. So that's cool.
Yeah, that was really neat. So the first game between two professional baseball teams was held in Indiana in 1871, and it was in Fort Wayne, the National Association contest between the Cleveland Forest Cities and the Fort Wayne Kicking Gas. Now, any Fort Wayne Kicking Gas fans out there, if I said that incorrectly,
I was gonna
please,
say, you're on
please
your own there.
Facebook us or call me at Shawswick, and I'll gladly issue a retraction. But on May 4th, 1871, Fort Wayne beat Cleveland 2-0. And baseball in that time, in 1871, and I got into this. Someone had redone the rules, or wrote out the rules and found them, and it made it into a nice document. And the batter during that time was called the striker. And if you caught a foul ball off of one bounce, it was an out, which is interesting. And this is minor, but it's just semantically interesting. The game then was called baseball, not single or put together, conjunction, but two words instead of baseball, which is interesting.
Now, there's a connection also with the Civil War, because that was played during the Civil War. There were actually truces during the times when the soldiers didn't fight, and this new game
Yeah.
was being played, and they called it rounders.
Oh, cool.
And so the two sides would actually say, okay, flag of truce, we're going to play rounders. And then after the
Yeah.
war,
Yeah,
it started to be more.
that's really cool.
Yeah, so I always try to find something connected to the Civil War, I have to be honest.
Well, I think that's a fair connection.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how baseball has served in a unique way through many wars.
Sure.
but dating
That's
back
right.
to the Civil War. And the first night baseball game under artificial lights was in Fort Wayne again in 1883. So again, you think about, major cities in baseball and sports history. You think of New York or Chicago, Los Angeles to some degree, but Fort Wayne is really the
Yeah.
hub of these two major events.
That's really, and again, that's not something, now maybe they teach it now because, there's more awareness of some of the, wanting to get kids more involved in their state. And maybe Indiana history's changed. I haven't taught fourth grade in a long, long, long time. But back when I took Indiana history, there was no
Oh, yeah.
mention of
When I
these-
taught it, I don't recall some of these things, and this is pretty cool.
Yeah,
To have
this
that kind of
big
anchor to a
connection.
to a
Yeah,
history
because we're
point.
considered a flyover state by most
Oh
people.
yeah, agreed.
And, it's kind of like Rodney Dangerfield. We just don't get the respect.
Exactly.
But, there's a
Exactly.
lot of things from Indiana that if we look back, we were kind of the
Yeah.
flagship of some of these things.
Well, even when we did our previous show on the massacre,
Oh, yeah.
the fact that whites were tried for killing, that was
Right.
that was a really unique
That
thing.
was a big thing, especially during the time when you could ask most anyone, and they didn't feel like killing a Native American or an
Yep.
Indian. That wasn't even
Well,
considered
it's property-ish,
wrong.
or some not property per se like a slave, but just like a throw off. It was a
Right.
human being.
Yeah, it's sad that we
Yeah.
have that part of our history, but
Yeah.
again, we need to talk about it so
Agreed.
that it's not repeated.
Yeah.
And, taken for granted that
Well,
we're
and
where we are.
And tying in now in heroic news, there Indiana again. Some people know it, and it's covered some, but the state of Indiana was a big shelter for runaway slaves. Which, as you think about moving up through to get to Michigan, or moving up that way to Minnesota to get to Canada, that would have been a good outlet. But in Indiana, in a place now called Fountain City, if you look it up, but it then was a farming community called Newport, was the family of Levi and Catherine Coffin. And these two Hoosier heroes played a major role in helping about 2,000 slaves, runaway slaves, make their way north to freedom. And this is covered some, which I like, because this is something that Indiana's, people know about to a degree, but I thought it was so great I wanted to highlight it.
Oh, sure.
And our 7th grade students on their field trip to the State Museum this year got to see a one-man play, a one-man, one-act play where a guy was playing Levi Coffin,
Oh,
talking
cool.
about in their house. Is fascinating. I'd love to
Yes.
visit it. Have you been to that house?
A long time ago, and I can't remember if it was on a field trip with one of my kids or if that was just something I did through a history grant that I took part in, but I have been.
It
But
sounded
it's
so
been a
neat
long
the way I
time.
was reading about it, that they had different compartments built in the house, and like sort of a Alice in Wonderland looking doorway where you go in and it opened up to like a little bedroom, and they had a different carriage where you could hide people under, but it didn't look from the outside like it was layered. Yeah.
False bottom. I know when Pam Horner was here and we did the talk on the Underground Railroad with Madison about some of the false, she had a drawing that she had made of a fireplace, that back inside the fireplace is where they could hide
Oh, that's so cool.
and hid, slaves. But, this area was pretty contentious between the people who supported the South and people who were living
Yeah.
here. Even though we were a no-slave state, there were still people who didn't really have that strong desire to protect the slaves if they came north. So I'm sure the Coffins also had neighbors.
Yeah. And what were some of the things that could happen if you,
well-
when people from the South came up, slave, runners and trying to catch them? And,
Right. We talked a little bit about the Fugitive Slave Act and the Fugitive Slave Laws, where they strengthened those because of, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and
Yeah.
all that had started. And so the court system changed as a result of that. So they passed where they would have certain judges who only handled these fugitive slave cases.
Wow.
And of course, there was some dirty politics going on, and some of these judges found fairly quickly that it behooved them more financially if they decided that this individual was a runaway slave. So they would send them back and make $10. But if they sided with the person, and the interesting was they couldn't defend themselves.
Yeah.
There was no allowing them to speak, so
Well,
that's another reason.
Even some rules, they couldn't. It was illegal for them to learn to read or write. So it's like
Right.
they couldn't even read to defend themselves on a law that could have helped them, or
Right.
if they could have fought against.
So $5 if you said, well, they are not the runaway. So it immediately made people feel like if they turned someone in, they were actually helping slavery.
Yeah.
And so they were kind of, maybe we just want to stay out of it. We don't want to
Yeah.
help either way.
And the Coffin family, that's 2,000, runaway slaves. Like we said, that's
That's
a
a big
huge thing. I
number.
mean, that's think about if a portion of those, whatever portion had kids, and I
Sure.
mean, what a legacy.
Yeah.
I mean, that I would imagine it's still Coffin family, not Coffin family, Coffin slave, descendants.
Right.
It's probably still around.
I'm sure they probably have some kind of connection where they
I hope
have,
they do. That'd be really
a
cool.
reunion. Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be neat.
They probably don't do that. Maybe don't do it in. Well, I don't know where they would do it at, but that's really neat. So,
Yeah.
and just because I love living in Bedford, and it's just a unique place. It's limestone capital of the world, and I
Right.
should have printed a few more pictures, but just as you guys know, and actually part of it's probably in this. So and this is a great callback because that is Governor Morton, and that is the Indianapolis, downtown Indy Monument Circle area. So I'm sure Indiana limestone is in there.
And we didn't show this one
Oh,
a while
I'm
ago.
so glad you're showing it,
and,
yes.
and I wanted to stick that in there because, we talked about the Indiana 27th, but there were so many,
Yeah.
200,000
Yes.
men who answered the call. And is this the 84th?
Yes, it is. 84th.
84th.
Infantry, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so that's a really
That's a
neat
great
picture.
shot, too.
I know, it's kind of like, well, we're kind of downtime.
Well, and you've looked at so many, old photographs too. How this is a good. They're all still. Like you had to really sit still. This wasn't like
Yes.
well, we're gonna do another one. I blinked. So
No,
that's a
and-
great photo considering
Yeah.
you can really make
Got
out.
that many
yeah.
people. And that's another reason why we don't really have any battle shots because they couldn't set up the,
Yeah, the exposure would be it wouldn't happen.
it was all a blur if you tried to do that.
Yeah.
So that's a really good picture. I'm glad
Yeah.
you brought that.
And we're talking about the limestone. It's just I want all our viewers to just again note that Empire State Building, the Pentagon, the National Cathedral. And that's partially why I tied this into the 1800s because plans for the National Cathedral were set in the late 1890s. So that kind of connects to the back end. But most of those are obviously made in the 1900s. But I just think it's pretty neat
Yeah.
that like just from down the road, limestone went to these buildings where millions and millions of people have visited and/or decisions were made in some of these buildings. Obviously, the Pentagon and
Now, was some of the limestone, like after 9/11, when the Pentagon was hit, did we supply the
new.
the new?
I was told we did to fix
Okay.
that spot.
Isn't that awful? I forgot that already. If we in the back of my mind, I was thinking we did.
Mhm.
That would be something, if you know and you're watching, drop us
Yeah,
a line.
please let us
'cause
know,
that's
'cause that'd be-
important to,
yeah.
to remember that.
And this is people, you may have educated here in town that worked at these places that might have sent some,
Sure.
to this new post 9/11 or historically our students worked in these quarries and like
Yeah,
put this stuff out there. So
that's really neat.
that's the main list of things I wanted to cover, and I wanted to thank you for your time and covering just
you're
Indiana and its historical aspects. And I can say for me and for the audience too, we're just excited to see where you take it into the 20th century.
Oh,
So
well, thank
exciting.
you.
It's been a great year of
tell you,
watching shows.
I don't know if you're a victim or if you're a volunteer, but you get
Oh,
the prize for being here
I'm
the
honored.
most.
I'm honored.
Because, I want to thank you and everybody that has been willing to come on and some had to get out of their comfort zone to be on here, and I appreciated that because they had so much to add that it just makes it really nice when people bring their knowledge
Yeah.
and share,
And she's not on camera with us, but Marie Edwards.
Yes.
And the BNL, the media team here. That's great to have this as
It's
an option. So
awesome.
we're thankful to her. And
Right.
you guys-
Kind of give you an idea of where we're going to go for the
Yeah.
next part of
I'm excited to know.
the series. We're going to start with 1900,
Mm-hmm.
and because other than the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, I'm kind of a geek about forensics.
Yeah.
And so the 1900s are going to open up with a cold case and some forensic. So we may be going on a remote location to do that. So that's kind of where we're going to start. We're going to start with the 1900s, and who knows? And if
Yeah.
you've got an idea, or if anybody has an
Yeah.
idea of where they would like to see
Yeah.
some of the shows take part, send us a comment and let us know, because really this is for you. We do this to educate and to learn ourselves, and I'd like to learn
I
more
love
about
that
the
you
area.
said that, because even when we've been researching, I'm learning more about
yeah.
different things. And like, I didn't know that about the 200,000 volunteers for the Hoosier, fighting in Civil War. That's amazing.
No, every show I've done, I've come away learning more
Yeah.
because of the research
Yeah.
that I've had, to do for the show. And so,
Yeah.
it's a learning process to be the teacher and the student when you do
Absolutely.
something like this.
That's very good.
So we want to thank Lucas Calhoun
Hey,
today,
my
our
pleasure.
sage on stage, and also to Maria Edwards and the whole group that put this together on the Star Station, because
Absolutely.
we wouldn't be sitting here without them. And so we appreciate that. And also you, the viewers, for watching. And we'd like to also take a moment. This will air obviously after this, but today is the 75th anniversary of D-Day. So thank a veteran of the Second World War, especially. All veterans deserve our thanks, but today is for them.
And in the paper, they've reposted, the Bedford paper, Ernie Pyle's follow-up from when he got on the beaches after.
Of Normandy.
It was phenomenal. Great, and the great Hoosier from Dana, Indiana. So
Sure, that would
was
be
great to read.
That would be something to get a hold of.
Absolutely.
These anniversaries are not going to always have people there who eyewitnessed it.
Did you see the footage of the veteran that did the paratrooping?
97 years old. That was amazing.
Yeah.
And I bet if President Bush would have still had his
Yes, HW.
yeah, if he had had his faculties with him, he would have been out that plane.
And he had been doing it.
Yeah.
Which was so cool.
Yeah, he would have been one of them.
Yeah.
19 years old when he piloted that
Yeah,
plane. So that's
amazing.
amazing. So, greatest generation for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for watching our show today. And with Lucas, I'm Lori Roberts. I'm your host for Historically Speaking. And thank you for watching.